Hey guys, Eric from Martin again. Welcome back to our next course in the xTool P2s Tumbler engraving. What we're going to cover today is we're going to go over setting up a file to engrave, setting up the tumbler to engrave, running a tape test first, covering again that seamless wrap transition, so what that's going to look like, though I can't remember if the wrap is seamless, so we will cover that, whether our wrap that we're doing actually is or not. And then after we cover the tape test, we're going to actually set that up to engrave, as well as talk about settings, where you can get to our settings sheet and what settings we use for different types of tumblers, whether they be tapered, non-tapered, the ones that we use for white, which is a bit different, and some other little kind of tweaks along the way. So without any further delay, let's get over to the laptop, get into xTool Studio, and we'll get into this one. All right, guys, so I've just downloaded a Tumbler file that we're going to use for this. I got this off of Etsy, and I got this actually from Kristen Thompson. So K-Tom Laser Designs, she's a great friend of mine and makes a bunch of awesome Tumbler wraps. I'll link you to her Etsy page. When you first bring a design in, all we did before starting this video was we opened a new tab, we connected to the P2s, and then we drug over a file. So you might get this every once in a while when you drag in a file. That your image is larger than the working area. Now, in this case, we're going to hit scale to fit. However, I recommend if you're importing an image that's a PNG, you do keep size so it doesn't scale it down. But scale to fit is fine with an SVG because we can just rescale it however big we want it to be. So this is the file that we brought in. Now, this is a full wrap tumbler. It is not seamless, so we're going to keep those things in mind. And as we look at this file, we'll learn a couple things. One is that this is a group, so it is not a compound vector. And if we want to, we can hit Control-Shift-G or Command-Shift-G to ungroup it, and we can edit all the individual things in this file if we wanted to. So I'm not going to do that, though. I'm going to leave this group together, and I'm actually going to make a copy of this to work on because we're going to add something to this. So before we go too far, let's go ahead and get our laser set up, right? So first thing we're going to do is we're going to connect to our P2s if you haven't already. And then we're going to choose that we're using the Chuck engraving mode. Now, once you have a Chuck engraving mode set up in the new version of xTool Studio, you're going to see this little Tumbler preview. But we're not going to use the RA3 auto mode. We're going to use our RA2 for this. So we're going to choose the RA2. And then what we're going to do also is we're going to type in the perimeter of what we're engraving. So we're doing that 40-ounce tumbler. As we talked about, diameter is the distance across the top. Perimeter is the circumference of the cup. That's what we use. And we use millimeters, and it's 315 millimeters. So we're going to go ahead and set that. Now, because we just aligned our tumbler, I know that it's in the right spot. So we can actually go ahead and take our distance measurement as well. So we're going to click this to get our quick measure. And actually my lid is open. So quick tip, while you can measure with your lid open, I don't recommend it. I recommend you shut your lid. So I just walked over and shut that. And we're going to take another distance measurement just to make sure. Again, this is all light based. So you notice we lost about 1/3 of a millimeter there. So we want to be as accurate as possible when doing these engravings. And to get the most accurate measurement out of the xTool machines, you're going to want to go ahead and make sure that your lid is closed so that no overhead lights may be interfering with your measurement. Now that we have everything measured, this is what our tumbler looks like. You see this green line is actually going to be our axis. So this is where the laser is moving. And then if you look at the bottom, it's actually going to tell you which way it's going to be rotating. It's going to be rotating away from you, or towards you, sorry. It does rotate this. So what you're looking at here, the top of this image is the left side of the machine. The right of this image, the bottom of this image is the right side of the machine. The left side is towards the front of the machine, and the right side is towards the back. So it does rotate it. It's a little weird. It's just the way it is. So that at least helps you orient yourself as you get used to engraving tumblers on the P2s. And before we even get into all of that, we're going to get our file ready. So as I mentioned, this is not a compound vector. So we're going to do a little bit of a lesson about what that means. So when you compound a vector, it takes all those individual groups and puts them into one vector object. Now, when you're doing something like a full wrap tumbler, it is super important on the xTool software that you make it a compound vector, especially if there are stuff on top of each other in terms of where the laser path will move. In terms of just doing a name or just a one-side engraving, something simple, it's not as critical. If I were to try and process this without making this a compound vector, it's going to take much longer than it would to do if you compounded it first. So we're going to make this a compound vector. Only took a second, and now all this is one item. Now, what we're also going to do before we engrave this is we're going to add a name to it. So this is a bit of a bonus. This is how I like to add names. This person's name is Sherry, who's getting this cut. So we're going to type in the name Sherry. We're going to set it to engrave. And then we're going to choose a font. We're going to use one called About Love because it's super popular. And I think she'll like this. And then what we're going to do is we're going to put this on top of the image. Now, there are two ways to do this, and both require you to do this first step. So the first thing we're going to do, since this is cursive and the letters overlap, is we're going to weld by clicking this welding icon. And then we're going to convert this to a path. So now instead of this being a font, this is actually now a path. Paths can be subtracted from other paths. And we're actually going to do her name up and down this way. And we're going to try not to kill anything too super important in this design. Let's make the different color just so we can see what we're doing. And I think maybe right here is the best place between this just spot and this duck. So if we put it over here, we're not going to get rid of anything too critical in the design. Now, there are two ways to do this, as I mentioned. So we're going to start with one, and then we'll show you the other. You can scale this to however big you want. You can use a template overlaid on here to make sure you're in the center if that's critical to your design. It's not on this one, so I'm not going to use the template. I'm just going to go ahead and overlay this. How I'm going to do this in xTool is I'm going to put an offset on this item. I'm going to do outer shapes only because I don't want little holes appearing in the middle. You don't have to do outer shapes only. If you want inside the L and inside the curves of the S to stay, you can. I'm going to confirm that offset. This was a 2mm offset. When you confirm it, your offset is automatically selected, so you don't have to select it again. If you click off of it, you can go back and choose your offset first, and then you're going to want to hold Shift and click your main image, and you're going to want to subtract that offset out of that image. So now you have your name there, and you can see it within your design. And now if we go ahead and make that black, you can see that that blends in pretty well. Now, I'm not going to engrave it this way because I think that this design would do really well with like a sticker type effect. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to create an offset that's 4mm, outer shapes only, confirm. I'm going to subtract that from the base to give us our empty space. And then I'm going to select the name again. We're going to create another offset that's 4mm. This one's going to stay, outer shapes only, confirm. Then we're going to select our name again. And we're going to do a smaller offset, outer shapes only, of 2mm. Now we're going to select, again, the one we just created is already selected. So we're going to leave that one selected. We're going to shift click and grab our second offset, which we click right here. We're going to subtract our second offset from our first one, and then we're going to set it to engrave. And now we have this sticker effect around her name. I think this helps a lot with getting it to stand out. I think it helps a lot with busy designs to make sure that doesn't look too crazy. And now we have a name on top of this wrap. And now what we're going to do is we're going to select everything, and we're going to make this one compound vector, because since we added two more vectors, now that's separate. So that's a quick little tutorial on how to add a name, or a couple different ways to do it, how to make a sticker effect. And then now we'll get into actually setting up the design to be engraved. Okay, perfect. So now that our design is ready to be engraved, let's talk about how we make sure that we have our placement right, how we measure, and everything else. So we've already taken our measurement, as I showed you before. Now we need to align our design. But before we align it, there's something you need to notice. So if you notice, if I were to move this over here and engrave like this, we're going to be upside down, right? Because this is the top of the tumbler, but this is the bottom of the design. So whenever you're engraving on the P2s, you need to rotate your design 180 degrees. either by using the rotate button or just coming up here and typing in 180 degrees in the top, whichever you prefer for your workflow. I typically just hold the shift key and drag this. It'll do it in 15-degree increments, I think, and you eventually get over to 180 pretty quickly, quicker than going up and typing 180. So now that we have this here, what we would do when we're ready to engrave is we would do a couple things. First, you want to make sure that how I align it is I zoom pretty far in and I put this green axis straight through the end of where this is. Now keep in mind, when I did my measurement, as you can see on my camera shot, the handles are to the side. So when you do your measurement, make sure your handles are rotated over, and that's how you go ahead and get your accurate measurement there. Now, once you have this design drug over here, we're actually going to pause for a minute and not do that, because what I want to show you is how to do a tape test. So to do a tape test, we're going to draw a rectangle. We're going to set it to engrave. And it's going to be a pretty thin rectangle. This one's 2 millimeters by, we're going to make it 235 because we know that's how tall our tumbler is. And then we're going to align it. So how we align our design or our tape test is by taking a close shot with the P2s. So we click the close shot button. We're going to come over and we're going to click. Pretty much you want the center of your camera to be where this line is, and also where the top of your tumbler design will be, which will be at the bottom of this like black plating. So we're going to take a close shot there. Let it load up. And we're going to see that this is the top of the tumbler. And we're going to drag it to right about there. So it's just sitting where it's supposed to be. And then we're going to validate that by doing another close shot at the bottom. I have found that the bottom of mine is more accurate than the top. And sometimes if I align on the bottom, I might be over the top a little bit, but it looks like this one's actually pretty accurate. So what you're going to look for is, you see this glare line right here. There's a little glare that you can see. If I can get my cursor to be big. That glare is where the light's reflecting. So you want to be above that glare. And then you can also see another little glare right here, which may be the second part of the lip right there. So because you're taking a picture, it may not be 100%, but that glare right there is where we want to be right above that. This is technically the bottom of the tumbler. Once you hit here, you're on the bottom and you're going to start going past it. So it's actually about perfect. To verify that we're where we want to be, what we can do is now engrave this. We're going to put a piece of tape on the laser first, and I'll show you how to do that really quickly, and then we'll jump right back into engraving this tape test. All right, so when we talk about a tape test, what we're talking about is engraving over some lines of masking tape to make sure that our design is indeed where we think it is and that we're not going to hit the tabs. So what I'm going to do to run this is we're going to put this straight up and down, and then we're going to just literally put tape on it. So we're going to start at the bottom, run it up, not at a crazy angle. Over the first tab, straight back down, over the second tab, straight back down, and onto the top of the tumbler. So what this allows us to test is, one, that our design is where we think it is in terms of top to bottom, and two, that we're not going to hit these tabs. So let's rotate this straight up until the light is over the tabs in this case, because that's our axis. And then let's get back over into the software and get this started, and then we'll show you what it looks like to engrave. All right, so now that we have our tape on our tumbler, we're going to go ahead and leave this exactly where it was. Now, this is a part that we're going to talk about for a second, and that's going to be adjusting our focal depth. This only applies if you put in that extra lens. So if you have the extra lens from the Amazon link that I provided, what you're going to do is you're going to change that, because the laser doesn't know that that lens is in there unless you tell it. So what you have to do is manually subtract some distance away from the lens. This only, of course, you only need to do this if you have the lens. If you have the stock lens, you're going to leave everything alone and you're going to proceed to start engraving. However, if you don't, then you're going to adjust this setting here and you're going to subtract 10 millimeters. So instead of 18.34, which is our reading, we're going to change this to 8.34. And that's going to adjust your image. Do not change any positioning once you've done this. All of your positioning needs to be changed before you go ahead and change that, because now your cameras are no longer accurate because you're telling it that it's actually only 8.3 millimeters away instead of 18. And then you're going to set your settings for this tape test. We're going to do like 3% power, maybe like 250 speed, 100 lines per centimeter is plenty. And we're going to leave that directly on the center here. Something is still on the engraving area. That's at 1%. I'd selected the wrong thing. So 3% power, 250 speed, 1 pass, 100 lines per centimeter. And then we're going to process this. It says it's going to take 32 seconds. Again, you don't need to let this run the whole way. So I'm going to go ahead and hit start, and then I'm going to start it on the laser, and we'll watch it engrave from over there. All right, so we've hit start on the machine. We're going to come over, we're going to hit start on the laser, and then it's going to go ahead and let's adjust this camera. It's going to glide right over those tabs. And we're going to stop it there. We don't need to let it run the whole time. You can long press to cancel a job on xTool, by the way, if you didn't know that. The laser will reset, or you can cancel from within the software itself. And then if we look down here, let me just adjust this camera. You can see that we're all the way at the bottom and we're all the way at the top. So we're top to bottom accurate on this, and we didn't hit the tabs. So we know that we're good to go. And from there, we can get back into processing our actual design. So let's jump back over and actually set up the design to engrave. Okay, cool. So now that our tape test is done, we know that we're placed correctly. We're going to take our object and put it right back where it should be. I'm going to change this manually because I know that we're supposed to be at 18.34. And then we're going to delete this tape test line, and we're going to drag our image over, make sure that it's upside down, because again, we talked about how making sure that that's the way that it goes. Actually, instead of deleting that tape test, I'm going to leave it right there, because that way we don't have to do any camera alignment. Since we've already done that part, we can simply drag this over, select both. We can align them left and then align them top. And that's going to drag that exactly where it should be. Now we can come in and grab this tape test and delete it out. So this is aligned exactly where the tape test was. What's important to note is I've rotated my tumbler around, right? So always start with your tabs directly up. That's how you make sure you're handle to handle and not starting from the middle of the tumbler. So if we refresh our camera view here, which it's going to move over and take a picture of the bottom of the tumbler too now, you'll see that the tabs are now facing straight up. You don't want to measure with the tabs straight up because, again, it'll throw off your distance measurement, but you do want to start the tumbler with the tabs straight up. And now we get into the fun part, which is settings. I'm going to include a link to my settings sheet. There are several settings that I use for tumblers. If I'm using the stock P2s lens, I'm going to use 75% power, 200 speed, 120 lines per centimeter on a standard tumbler. And that's on a full wrap. If I'm using the 2.5-inch lens, I'm just going to bump that speed up by 50 to 250. And then from there, the only difference is whether I'm doing tapered tumblers and then whether I'm doing white. So let's stick to tapered tumblers for right now. So say we're doing a full wrap on a Stanley tapered tumbler. You're going to see my settings at 75, 250, 120. That's for anything but white plated tumblers. You'll see that on white plated tumblers, I have my own setting, tumbler wrap white plated. I do 5% higher power. That's 80% power, 250 speed, 120 lines per centimeter. You'll see if I'm not doing a tapered tumbler, I lower my power down to 45. So 45% power, 250 speed, 120 lines per centimeter. You might be thinking, why, if it's the same material? The difference is because everything's on the same plane. The reason that the power is higher on the taper tumblers is because that extra power helps you get through that extra focal range and distance. Because even though the tumbler is level, it's not the same distance to every point on that tumbler. You're still only measured for the highest point of the tumbler, which is that top part, or that the highest part of that top piece. So again, there's a link to a settings sheet, but it is important to kind of understand what the settings are. The good thing about a CO2 laser is you're not going to burn through the metal. So if you have a doubt about something, crank your power up a little bit. You're not going to burn through the metal. You're not going to burn through the plating. Even at 80% power, you're not going to burn through that plating, and just let it run. If you're doing a super detailed engraving, this one doesn't have anything too tiny except these little details. You know, I might increase up to 140 or 160 lines per centimeter just to give you a little bit more depth. But again, only on some designs. On most designs, it's totally fine just running at 120. So I might run this one at 140. And the only other thing you need to remember is if you have the special lens in there, the 2.5-inch lens, the 63.5mm lens, you need to subtract 10 millimeters on tumblers. The reason why is, again, when you measure using this laser measure, you're measuring the distance between the nozzle and the material, or really the lens and the material. So it's telling it that it's 18.34 millimeters away. So that's how far it needs to drop the nozzle to accommodate for that. Well, technically that's true, but if you have a 2.5-inch lens on there, you've moved your focal point to be 1/2 inch further away. So this needs to be 1/2 inch further away. So you would maybe think, well, shouldn't I increase it? Well, no, because you're measuring distance. So what you need to do is decrease the distance. It's going to lift up the tumbler, it's going to lift up the lens, thinking that your tumbler is higher than it is, and it's going to move the lens 1/2 inch further away. Now, 1/2 inch is actually 12.7 millimeters. However, on tumblers, we found that a slight defocus really does help. So we're going to only decrease this by 10 millimeters to 8.34. However, quick side note, not related to tumblers, if you're doing wood or acrylic or something flat, I do recommend adjusting by 12.7 millimeters. The way to tell whether you should use reduce by 12.7 or add 12.7 is based on whether this box right here says distance or thickness. So if this is a distance box, when you click in, then you're going to subtract. If this is a thickness, if you're using the slats and it's automatically measuring the thickness of the material, then you're going to add thickness, because then it's going to think your item is thicker and move it further away instead of subtracting distance. Hope that makes sense. Once that's ready to go, and once you have your settings set up, you literally just hit process. You hit start down here. It's going to estimate your time. This is where you'll tell the difference between if you accidentally left it uncompounded or not, because this would be several hours. Usually this would be about 45 to 55 minutes for most tumblers. The reason this is over an hour is because I bumped it to 140 lines per centimeter, so it takes a little longer to get through it. And then once you hit start and it sends that file over to the machine, all you got to do is go press that button to start it on the laser. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to switch over to the other camera, let it run this engraving. I'm going to let it capture a time lapse. And then at the end of it, we're going to go over cleaning. We're going to go over, again, how to access some of those some of those resources like our spreadsheets and setting sheets. And then another thing that we're going to cover is just how to troubleshoot some failed engraves and what some different failures may look like and what settings may control those and how to adjust. So without further ado, let's get into letting this tumbler engrave, and we'll be right back with the next video.